The machine screamed. A mysterious illness was killing the billionaire patient, and the hospital's star surgeon was stumped. "It's a ghost," he muttered, defeated. But the old black woman cleaning the floors looked at the chart and saw the one simple thing he'd missed. She knew this wasn't a disease. It was a poisoning, and she knew exactly who did it. To the brilliant, fast-moving doctors of St. Jude's University Hospital, Esther Mae was a fixture, as much a part of the pristine ICU as the humming ventilators and beeping heart monitors. At 68, with her silver hair neatly tucked into a net and her movements slow but deliberate, she was the night shift cleaner for the VIP wing, a ghost in a pale blue uniform, wiping away the sterile residue of the day's life-or-death dramas. They saw her, but they didn't see her. They saw a stooped, elderly woman who emptied trash cans and polished floors, her presence a quiet, unassuming hum in the background of their high-stakes world. They never suspected that the eyes that followed their every move had once read pathology reports, or that the hands that now held a mop had once held a medical degree. The chaos began on a Tuesday night in the ICU's most exclusive suite. The patient was Arthur Vance, a billionaire philanthropist whose generous donations had funded the very wing he now occupied. A week ago, he'd been admitted with what seemed like a simple, albeit severe, case of pneumonia. But his condition had taken a bizarre and terrifying turn. His organ systems were failing, one by one, in a cascade that defied all medical logic. His lungs, then his kidneys, then his liver. The best specialists in the country had been flown in, but every test came back inconclusive. There was no known disease that matched his symptoms. At the center of the storm was Dr. Evan Reed, the 34-year-old wunderkind chief of surgery. With his sharp blue eyes, perfectly coiffed hair, and a god complex nurtured by a string of miracle surgical saves, Reed was the undisputed star of St. Jude's. He moved through the world with an unshakable belief in his own brilliance. "It makes no sense," he snapped, staring at the bank of monitors displaying Vance's chaotic vitals. "The blood work is clean, no signs of infection, no markers for any known autoimmune disorder. It's like his body is just giving up." The team of residents and specialists around him murmured in agreement, their faces etched with a mixture of exhaustion and fear. They had tried everything: aggressive antibiotics, steroids, dialysis, but nothing worked. Arthur Vance was dying, and no one knew why. From the corner of the room, where she was carefully wiping down an forced stand, Esther watched. She had been on shift for 6 hours, a silent observer to the escalating panic. She had listened to the medical jargon, watched them cycle through theories, and seen the growing desperation in Dr. Reed's eyes. But unlike them, she wasn't looking at the machines. She was looking at the room. Her eyes, trained by a lifetime of observation, scanned the details the doctors were too busy to notice. The half-eaten tray of food from dinner, the bouquet of exotic flowers on the windowsill, the small, ornate box of imported teas on the bedside table, a gift from Vance's much younger, impeccably dressed wife who had been visiting earlier. As she emptied the small trash can by the bed, her fingers brushed against a discarded wrapper from one of the tea bags. She paused, her eyes catching the faint, almost unreadable text. It was an herbal blend, something with a complex, foreign name. A detail so small, so insignificant, that no one would ever think to question it. But Esther knew. She had seen this before, a long, long time ago. In a different life, in a different place. She felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. She looked from the wrapper to the patient, noting the specific, subtle symptoms the doctors were missing in their search for a grand, unifying diagnosis. The slight tremor in his eyelids, the faint, almost imperceptible bluish tint to his nail beds, the specific way his breathing hitched between the machine-forced respirations. They were looking for a disease. A ghost in the machine. Esther knew this wasn't a ghost. It was a poison. A rare, slow-acting neurotoxin derived from a specific type of ornamental flower. A flower that was almost certainly in that innocent-looking herbal tea. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was no accident. The knowledge of the poison was a cold, heavy stone in Esther's gut. She had spent 30 years burying the woman she used to be, Dr. Esther Mae, a promising toxicologist whose career was destroyed when she exposed a powerful pharmaceutical company for falsifying safety data. They had blacklisted her, turning her name to ash in the medical community. She had learned the hard way that the truth, when aimed at the powerful, was a weapon that often backfired. Now, she was just a cleaner, and to speak up was to risk everything. She continued her work, her movements slow and methodical, a perfect mask for the frantic calculations happening in her mind. She couldn't confront Dr. Reed directly. The arrogant young doctor would have her thrown out before she could finish a sentence. She needed to plant a seed, a clue so subtle he might think he discovered it himself. Her chance came when a young resident, looking flustered, dropped a patient chart near the waste bin. As Esther bent to pick it up, she, accidentally, let her gaze linger on the lab results page. "Excuse me, doctor," she said, her voice soft and deferential as she handed the chart back. "I'm sorry to bother you, but my late husband, he had a terrible reaction to some herbal remedies once." The symptoms were so strange. The doctors were baffled for the longest time. The resident barely glanced at her. "Thank you," he mumbled, already turning away. "It was the tea," Esther added, just loud enough for him to hear. Something about the flowers in it made his nerves go all haywire. She saw a flicker of annoyance, not curiosity, in the young doctor's eyes before he disappeared into the central nursing station. The seed had been planted, but she feared it had fallen on barren ground. Later, Arthur Vance's wife, Serena, arrived. She was a vision in cream-colored cashmere, her beauty as flawless and cold as a marble statue. She glided into the room, a sad, concerned expression perfectly arranged on her face. "How is he, doctor?" she asked Dr. Reed, her voice a delicate, worried whisper. "There's no change, Mrs. Vance," Reed admitted, his frustration evident. "We're doing everything we can." "I brought him some more of his favorite tea," Serena said, placing a new, beautifully wrapped box on the bedside table. "The doctors in Switzerland recommended it. They said it helps with everything." She smiled a fragile, tragic smile. "It's the only comfort I can offer him now." Esther watched from the hallway as Serena leaned over her husband, whispering words of love to the unconscious man. She watched as Serena then turned to a nurse and said, "Could you be a dear and brew a fresh cup for him? He should have it when he wakes." The nurse, eager to please the billionaire's wife, immediately complied. No one else saw the brief, cold glint of triumph in Serena's eyes before she replaced it with the mask of the grieving wife. But Esther saw it, and it confirmed everything. That night, Esther knew she had to try again, more directly this time. As she was cleaning Dr. Reed's empty office, she saw an opportunity. On his desk was a medical textbook, open to a chapter on rare neurological disorders. Using a pen from her pocket, she made a small, almost unnoticeable mark in the index at the back of the book. A tiny dot next to a single entry, aconitine. Monkshood, a beautiful, ornamental flower whose roots, when processed, created a potent, slow-acting neurotoxin that mimicked the symptoms of progressive organ failure. The very flower listed as the primary ingredient on the tea's wrapper. The next morning, Dr. Reed was reviewing Vance's chart when the young resident from the night before approached him hesitantly. "Sir," he began, "it's probably nothing but the night cleaner. She mentioned something strange last night. About herbal tea." Reed looked up from the chart, his expression withering. "Are you seriously bringing me medical theories from the janitorial staff?" "No, sir, of course not," the resident stammered. "It was just a coincidence. I'll get back to my rounds." Reed shook his head in disgust and returned to the chart, dismissing the comment entirely. His pride, his absolute faith in his own diagnostic process, made him blind to a truth that was right in front of him. He was looking for a complex answer, and the simple one was too humiliating to consider. Frustrated, Esther realized she had to take a bigger risk. She found a young, compassionate-looking nurse named Chloe who had always treated her with kindness. "Chloe, dear," Esther began, her voice trembling slightly for effect. "I'm so worried about Mr. Vance. My grandmother back home in Louisiana, she used to be a healer. She knew all about herbs, and she always warned us about certain pretty flowers. Said they could make a strong man weak, shut his body down from the inside out if prepared the wrong way." Chloe listened patiently, her brow furrowed with concern. "What are you saying, Esther?" "I'm just an old woman who worries," Esther said, pulling the crumpled tea wrapper from her pocket. "But when I saw this in his trash, It just reminded me of my grandmother's warnings. Chloe took the wrapper, studying the unfamiliar name. A seed of doubt had been successfully planted. The moment of truth came hours later. Arthur Vance's heart monitor suddenly blared, a long, piercing alarm. His heart rate was plummeting. "He's crashing," Reed shouted, rushing into the room. "Get me a crash cart." As the medical team swarmed around the bed, a frantic, desperate energy filling the room, Chloe, the young nurse, pushed through. "Doctor," she said, her voice high with urgency. "The tea," the cleaner said. "Not now," Reed snapped, focused on his patient. But as they prepared the defibrillator paddles, Esther stepped out of the shadows of the doorway. Her voice was no longer the soft, deferential whisper of a cleaner. It was the clear, commanding voice of a physician. "Don't shock him," she said. "You'll kill him. It's not his heart. It's a toxin, and you have to counteract it right now." "Of course. I apologize again for the mix-up. Here is the third part of the story, the cleaner's diagnosis." The room froze. The frantic energy of the crash team dissipated, replaced by a stunned, electric silence. Dr. Reed, defibrillator paddles in hand, spun around to face Esther. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "Who in God's name do you think you are?" he snarled, his voice dangerously low. "Get out of my ICU. Security." But Esther didn't move. She stood in the doorway, her small frame radiating an authority that belied her uniform. The decades of forced invisibility had fallen away, and in her place stood Dr. Esther Mae, a toxicologist at the top of her field. "The patient is suffering from aconitine poisoning," she said, her voice clear and precise, cutting through the tension. "It's a cardiotoxin. If you shock him, the electrical current will potentiate the toxin's effect and stop his heart permanently. You will kill him." The medical team stared, bewildered. The words were specific, clinical. This was not the rambling of a confused old woman. "This is insane," Reed spat, though a flicker of doubt had entered his eyes. "He has no signs of poisoning. The toxicology screens were clean." "Because you were screening for the wrong things," Esther countered, stepping further into the room. "You were looking for barbiturates, opiates, heavy metals. You weren't looking for a rare, plant-based alkaloid. The lab wouldn't even have it in their standard panel. It's in the tea his wife has been giving him." At the mention of the tea, Chloe, the young nurse, gasped. "She's right, doctor. She told me." "Quiet," Reed snapped, but his confidence was visibly crumbling. He looked at the monitor, at the chaotic rhythm of Vance's failing heart, then back at Esther. He was a man whose entire world was built on data and credentials, and he was being challenged by the one person in the room with neither. But he was also a doctor watching his patient die? "Fine," he bit out, the word sharp as a shard of glass. "You want to play doctor? You have 1 minute. 1 minute to tell me something that isn't a wild guess from a TV show. What's the antidote?" It was the ultimate test. A desperate, arrogant challenge meant to expose her as a fraud. Esther didn't hesitate. "There is no direct antidote for aconitine. Treatment is supportive. You need to administer atropine to counteract the bradycardia and lidocaine for the ventricular arrhythmias. But most importantly, you need to flush his system. Immediately. Activated charcoal via a nasogastric tube, and you need to start him on continuous renal replacement therapy to filter the toxin from his blood." The room was silent. The specificity of her instructions, the confident delivery of a complex treatment protocol, was undeniable. The young resident's eyes widened in recognition. He had just read a paper on that exact treatment for exotic alkaloid poisonings. Dr. Reed stood rooted to the spot. His entire worldview was being dismantled by a woman in a cleaner's uniform. To follow her orders would be to admit that his own brilliance had failed, that he had been blind. To ignore her would be to let his patient die. "Do it," he finally choked out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He threw the defibrillator paddles onto the crash cart. "Get me atropine and lidocaine now. Someone prep an NG tube with charcoal. And get nephrology on the phone. I want a CRRT machine in here 10 minutes ago." The team sprang into action, a flurry of controlled chaos, but this time with a clear direction. As they worked, Reed approached Esther, his eyes a storm of conflicting emotions. "How?" he asked, the single word containing a universe of questions. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because 30 years ago, I was the one who wrote the original toxicology report on aconitine poisoning for the CDC after a diplomat was assassinated with it in Tokyo," Esther said quietly, her voice devoid of any triumph. "My name was Dr. Esther Mae. You can look it up, if my file hasn't been completely erased." Before Reed could process this, Serena Vance, Arthur's wife, appeared in the doorway, her face a perfect mask of concern. "What's happening?" she cried. "I heard the alarms." She rushed to the bedside, her eyes falling on the team working frantically on her husband. Then she saw Esther, standing beside Dr. Reed, no longer a background figure, but an active participant. Serena's mask of grief faltered for a split second, replaced by a flash of pure, cold panic. "What is she doing in here?" Serena demanded, her voice sharp. "She's helping us save your husband," Reed replied, his gaze now fixed on Serena with a dawning, terrible suspicion. He looked from the box of imported herbal tea on the bedside table to Serena's perfectly composed face. He remembered her words from earlier. The doctors in Switzerland recommended it. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his tone now dangerously neutral. "This tea, where exactly did you get it?" Serena's eyes darted from Reed to Esther, then back again. She was trapped. From a specialty wellness boutique. "Why?" "Because," Reed said, his voice dropping as the pieces clicked into place, "it appears to be the source of the poison that is killing your husband." Of course. Here is the fourth part of the story, the cleaner's diagnosis. Serena Vance's mask of the grieving wife didn't just crack, it shattered. For a split second, a look of pure, venomous hatred flashed in her eyes before she replaced it with a masterful performance of wounded indignation. "Poison?" she gasped, placing a hand over her heart. "Doctor, that is a monstrous accusation. That tea is a world-renowned wellness blend. Are you suggesting I would harm my own husband?" "I'm suggesting, Dr." Reed said, his voice now cold and hard as he stepped between Serena and the bed, "that your husband's symptoms are a textbook match for aconitine poisoning, and that tea is the only unexplained variable that has been introduced into his system. So I'll ask you again, Mrs. Vance, where did you get it?" Serena drew herself up, her beauty a weapon she was accustomed to wielding. "This is absurd. I will not be interrogated by a doctor who has clearly failed in his duties and is now looking for a scapegoat. I'm calling my lawyer." She turned on her heel and strode out of the room, a picture of offended dignity. But Esther and Reed both saw the truth in her panicked retreat. "Get that tea to the lab immediately," Reed commanded the young resident. "Tell them to run a full toxicology screen for plant-based alkaloids, specifically aconitine. And get security up here. Mrs. Vance is not to leave this hospital." As the team continued to work on stabilizing Arthur Vance, the atmosphere in the ICU shifted. The frantic energy of fighting an unknown enemy was replaced by the focused, determined effort of fighting a known one. Esther remained in the room, no longer a cleaner but a quiet, authoritative presence. She didn't interfere, but she observed, occasionally offering a quiet suggestion to Nurse Chloe, who had become her de facto liaison. "Watch his potassium levels," she murmured. "The toxin causes hyperkalemia. You'll need to be ready with insulin and glucose." Dr. Reed, humbled and stripped of his usual arrogance, watched Esther with a mixture of awe and profound shame. This woman, whom he had dismissed and overlooked, possessed a depth of knowledge that dwarfed his own in this specific life-or-death situation. Later that night, while waiting for the lab results, Reed sat in his office, the door open. He had his laptop out, and after a few minutes of searching through archived medical databases, he found it. A single, heavily redacted file. Esther Mae, M.D., Ph.D., subject, review of professional conduct, case file number 734. Status, license revoked. Blacklisted. There were no details of the case, only the brutal finality of the verdict. She hadn't been lying. She was a brilliant physician who had been professionally executed. He looked up to see Esther standing in the doorway, holding a fresh cup of coffee. She hadn't been asked to get it. It was a simple gesture of empathy. "The team is doing well," she said, her voice once again the soft, unassuming tone of the cleaner. "Mr. Vance's heart rhythm is stabilizing." Reed took the coffee, the warmth a small comfort in the sterile coldness of the hospital. "They're doing well because of you," he said, his voice raw with an honesty he rarely allowed himself. I was blind. I was arrogant. I almost killed him. You were following the data you had, Esther replied, offering a grace he didn't deserve. The most dangerous enemy is the one you don't know to look for. Dr. Mae, he began, using her title for the first time. I'm sorry for what happened to you. Your file, it's been scrubbed, but it's clear you were wronged. A sad, weary smile touched Esther's lips. The truth is a dangerous thing to carry, doctor, especially when it gets in the way of profits. I learned that a long time ago. I need your help, Reed said, the words a plea. Officially, the lab will confirm the poison, but this is now a criminal matter. The police will be involved. They will need an expert witness, someone who can explain this to a jury, someone who can stand up to Serena Vance's team of high-priced lawyers. They will need you. Esther's smile faded. The thought of stepping back into that world, of depositions, of character assassinations, of having her past dredged up and twisted, was terrifying. I can't, she said, shaking her head. I'm a cleaner. That part of my life is over. Is it? Reed challenged gently. Or did it just walk back into your life when Arthur Vance was admitted? You have a choice, doctor. You can go back to being invisible, or you can help us get justice for that man in there. The man you just saved. Before she could answer, Nurse Chloe rushed into the office, her face pale. Doctor, you need to see this. She led them back to the ICU suite. The police had arrived, and 2 detectives were speaking with a security guard outside Arthur Vance's room. What's going on? Reed demanded. The patient's wife, the guard said, pointing a thumb towards the room. She came back about 20 minutes ago, said she needed to collect her personal things. We had orders not to let her leave the hospital, but not to bar her from the room. The senior detective, a grim-faced man named Miller, pushed the door open. The room was empty. Serena Vance was gone. And on the bedside table, where the ornate box of imported tea had been, there was nothing. The evidence had vanished. She must have used a service exit, the guard stammered. We're checking the cameras now. Esther walked slowly into the room, her eyes scanning every detail. The police would see an empty room. She saw a crime scene that had been expertly sanitized. But Serena, in her panic, had made one small, crucial mistake. Esther knelt by the waste bin, the same one she had emptied the night before. She reached in, past the new liner, and her fingers found what she was looking for, stuck to a bit of adhesive at the very bottom. She stood up and opened her hand. In her palm lay the crumpled, discarded wrapper from the first tea bag. The one piece of evidence Serena had forgotten. She's not just a grieving wife, Detective Miller said grimly, looking at the empty room. She's a professional. Yes, Esther said, holding up the wrapper. But professionals still make messes. And I'm very, very good at cleaning them up. The single tea wrapper became the linchpin of the entire investigation. The hospital lab, guided by Esther's specific instructions, confirmed the presence of aconitine residue on the foil. It was the concrete evidence Detective Miller needed. Armed with the wrapper and a sworn affidavit from Dr. Reed detailing Esther's diagnosis, the police obtained a warrant for Serena Vance's arrest. But Serena, wealthy and well-connected, had vanished. She had fled to a country with no extradition treaty, leaving behind a team of lawyers to issue public statements proclaiming her innocence and painting her as a grieving widow being harassed by an incompetent hospital. Meanwhile, Arthur Vance was slowly, miraculously, pulling back from the brink. Under Esther's quiet guidance, officially an unpaid consultant at Dr. Reed's insistence, the ICU team managed his recovery with a precision they never could have achieved alone. Esther's knowledge of the toxin's specific effects allowed them to anticipate and counteract each new symptom before it became critical. Dr. Reed, a changed man, became her staunchest ally. He spent hours on the phone with the hospital board, fighting to have Esther's medical credentials temporarily reinstated. I don't care what happened 30 years ago, he was overheard shouting at the hospital's legal counsel. That woman's expertise is the only reason our most prominent patient is still alive. We owe her everything. The story of the night shift cleaner who saved the billionaire became a quiet legend within the hospital walls. Nurses who had once overlooked Esther now greeted her with a new respect. Doctors who had dismissed her now sought her opinion on difficult cases. She handled the newfound attention with the same quiet grace she had always possessed, deflecting praise and focusing only on the patient. How did you know? Arthur Vance rasped one evening, his voice weak but clear for the first time in weeks. He was awake, lucid, and staring at Esther, who was adjusting his pillows. "I'm just observant," Esther replied, her voice soft. "No," Vance insisted, his eyes sharp. "Reed told me everything. You were a doctor. They destroyed you." "A long time ago," she said. "Why did you help me?" he asked. "After what the world did to you, why would you step back in?" Esther looked at the man in the bed, a man who had everything and had almost lost it all. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said simply. "And because no one deserves to have their life stolen from them by a poison they never saw coming." Her words resonated with him. 2 weeks later, Arthur Vance, now strong enough to sit in a chair, held a press conference from his hospital room. The story the world was expecting was one of a miraculous recovery. The story he gave them was one of justice. "My recovery is thanks to 2 people," he announced, his voice steady. Dr. Evan Reed, whose humility and skill are a credit to this hospital. And, more importantly, Dr. Esther Mae. He told the world her story. He told them about the brilliant toxicologist who had been blacklisted for telling the truth, who had been forced into a life of invisible, menial labor. He told them how she had saved his life with knowledge she should have been using to save countless others for the past 30 years. "My wife, Serena, attempted to murder me for my fortune," he stated, his voice ringing with cold fury. "But the greater crime is what the medical establishment did to Dr. Mae. They tried to bury a brilliant mind, and in doing so, they failed every patient who could have benefited from her knowledge. That ends today." The fallout was immediate and seismic. The story exploded. News outlets that had once ignored Esther now clamored for her interview. The pharmaceutical company that had blacklisted her 30 years ago saw its stock plummet. The state medical board, under immense public pressure, announced it was reopening the review of her case. Serena Vance was eventually apprehended in a foreign country after Arthur used his considerable influence to close the diplomatic loopholes she had hidden behind. Faced with a mountain of evidence, including financial records showing she had purchased the rare tea from a black market source, she was extradited and convicted. On the day of Serena's sentencing, Esther sat not in the gallery, but in Arthur Vance's hospital room, watching him take his first, unsteady steps with a physical therapist. "The board officially reinstated my license this morning," she said quietly, holding a letter in her hand. "They offered me a position, head of a new toxicology research department, funded by an endowment." "My endowment," Arthur said with a small smile, leaning on his walker. "It's the least I could do. Will you take it?" Esther looked out the window at the city below. For 30 years, she had been a ghost, a shadow. She had accepted her fate, finding a quiet dignity in her work. But now, the world was offering her a second chance, a chance to be seen again. "Yes," she said, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "I think I will." Dr. Reed entered the room, no longer the arrogant prodigy, but a more thoughtful, humbled physician. "Dr. Mae," he said, nodding respectfully, "we have a new admission. A child with an unidentified allergic reaction. The team is stumped. We were hoping you might have a look." Esther looked at Arthur, who winked at her. "Of course, doctor," she said, her voice clear and confident. "Let's get to work." She walked out of the room, no longer Esther the cleaner, but Dr. Mae, the physician who had stepped out of the shadows to reclaim her life, her name, and her sacred calling to heal. How many brilliant minds have been silenced by systems that fear the truth? And what miracles might happen if we only chose to look past the uniform and see the person standing right in front of us? If this story inspired you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late to be seen.